Okay, so I guess the first thing is to make sure that you do have V-Ray installed so that you can access all the controls. Would be to go up to Render, go to Current Renderer, and change that to V-Ray for Rhino. If you have other plugins, it'll change all of those things. If you don't have that, then it's not correctly installed. Okay? So then when you click on that, you should get this toolbar right here. This is the 2.0 toolbar. For 3.0, I think there's 4 buttons. They're really small, kind of the same size, but that's what that would look like. And then so, let's say, I'll show you what we start with, and I can show you how we change all those things. So these buttons here, I'll go over most of them. You won't end up using all of them. But the first one is the material editor. That's how you make color and textures and things and then apply them to the geometry in the scene. The next one is options for V-Ray itself. The size, the quality, the camera controls, all that kind of stuff. You'll find that under there. F is the frame buffer. I'll show you that in a second. R is just the render button. So when you have it all set up, you press R and that renders the scene. RT is real-time rendering. I don't recommend that for laptops. It just really slows your system down. It does the same thing as render, but if you rotate your model, it kind of re-renders wherever the model lands. You could do it if you want. I don't recommend it. This next one is an infinite plane. So if you just have an object and you want to give it a ground, give it an infinite plane so it casts a shadow, all that kind of stuff. We have our button to add a sunlight system so we can mimic real-world lighting conditions. We have a lot of other kinds of lights that would mimic, light bulbs or lamps or any other sort of man-made light. I never use this and I never use that, but there's those buttons if you want to see what they do. So if I just click render, what happens is this window that popped up, that's called the frame buffer, and the little the little buckets that run, they're called buckets. That's kind of a link between your computer's processor power and how much of the image is being processed at one time. Some computers have 2, some computers have 1,000. It just depends. But as it's going through and calculating all of that, it changes the geometry we have into an image. Right now it's dark, there's no color, there's no strong light source, no texture, anything like that. So by doing this baseline render, we can look at the things that we need to work on, right? Let me change something real quick so we don't have that again. So let's say we want to give something a color. We won't worry about patterns or textures or anything like that. Let's just say we want to render something in a different color. What I'll do is I will create a material that will change the color of the house, and I'll do it a different color from purple just so you see that the layer color doesn't necessarily translate to the render color. Okay? So to give something a material, very easy. You click on the M, the material editor button, and then this window pops up. And if it's the first time you've opened the file, there should be nothing there. If there is something there, then you probably got the file from somewhere else. You imported something that had a material, whatever. But what I want to do is right-click on Scene Materials, go to Create Material, and we get a bunch of options here. The only 2 that I ever find myself using are V-Ray Material and Standard. And I'll show you the difference between both. But for this case right now, I'm going to select a V-Ray material. So I'll click on that, and right here, this little this preview, if you have live update enabled, it'll show you what it looks like right now. It's, you know, dark gray, medium roughness, no, it's not shiny, it's not reflective, it's not see-through, none of that. And I just want to change the color of it. What I'll do first is I'll double click to change the name of the material so I know what color goes with what. And I'll just change it to house, which happens to match up with the layer that that geometry is on. It's kind of nice to keep those things in order. And now if I want to change the color, right here where it says diffuse, there's a little swatch. Diffuse just means color. So if I click on that swatch, I get the color picker that pops up, and I can choose any color. Let's say we want the house to be pink. So now that I've changed that, the little preview of the material looks more red on here. It's pink on here, trust me. That will update. And now if I want this material to associate itself with geometry in the file, I just right click on the material and I go apply material to layer, and all my layers pop up and I pick which one. I'll say house. And now over here where I look at the, where I have my layer properties, under material, it's got house associated with the house layer. So now if I render, I can see that the house changes to pink rather than being gray, right? The industry term for that color is just clay. It just means an untextured model. I'm going to change some of my settings so you see what I see. I'll change them a bit later. That's a little better. So, I mean, in terms of the image, you're still missing a lot of things. But now I can change the color of anything that's on that layer. If I wanted to change it to something completely different, I just go back to the material editor, I select that material, and I go back to diffuse, and let's say we make it, I don't know, bright green. The material will update here, and then when I re-render, it updates that material. I don't have to keep applying the material. As long as it's associated by layer, any change I make to the material changes to whatever geometry is on that layer. Additionally, if I wanted to include other things on that layer, for example, if I wanted this wall to also be that same color, rather than giving it its own color, I can just change that object's layer, and then when I render it, it'll be rendered in the same color as the layer that it's on. Okay? Questions so far? All right. So I'm going to take that off of that layer. And one thing we're going to have, well, what we're going to have to do is nothing in our world is ever one solid color. So we have to use images and texture maps and different lighting conditions to approximate the way that things look in our world. You know, even you could say, oh yeah, this table is white, but it's got a lot of different colors of white. There's scratches and cuts and tape and glue, so it's not just a white table, right? It's the same thing for everything. Even, you know, a solid color shirt, you know, it's like a micro blend, there's another color in there, right? It's not just one solid color. So that's what we do for creating a different type of material, okay? So if I want to create a material like that, I'll go back to the material editor. I will right-click again on the scene materials, go to create material, And I'm going to do the most complex one first so that all of the other ones kind of are less complex. But in this case, I'm going to select a standard material rather than a V-Ray material. And as I get further into it, I'll show you why. But for now, I'll select standard. And then I'm going to rename it walls. Say all of the walls in this scene here will treat the same way. So it is, we have different controls over all of this here. And it's just a different way of creating a material. But the biggest difference between just changing the color of something and adding an image to some geometry so it gets rendered that way is I'm going to click, rather than on this swatch to change the color, I'm going to click on this M right here. And what that does is it brings up this window right here. And it doesn't show anything, so that's not helpful. But what you do is you click on the drop down and you go to TEX bitmap, texture bitmap. That's just another way of saying I'm going to associate a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF to wrap around this kind of material. So I'll click on that, and then when I do that, it opens up a file explorer where I can select what image I want to use. So let's say I go to, this is the same folder that I gave you guys, so you can use it if you want. I'll go to textures, and let's say we use this one right here. I use it in the other class, and it looks nice. So, texture 33, okay? You can use any one you want. I'm going to use this one. I'll double click on that. And now, when I say OK, the little update here shows that image wrapped around that same sphere. Okay? That's just a preview. But now what I can do, we'll right-click on the material, apply material to layer, and I'll select my walls layer. And now it's not gonna look super great because we still have a lot of work to do. But if I click render, that image is now wrapped around everything that I said was on the wall layer. Okay? Super simple, right? It's not some mystery. Yeah.
What was the term you used?
Bitmap. Yeah. That's what you do want to select. Some of the other ones will work similarly, but it's just another name for, hey, I have this image, wrap it around that geometry. And the way that it gets wrapped and what geometry it gets wrapped to is technically what's called texture mapping or UV editing. I'll get into that.
Yeah, quick question. For Rhino, I messed around with it the other day and I noticed you can do material changes in Rhino. Some of them changed and some of them didn't. What is that feature for then if not, or is it just like an extra feature of rendered whatever?
So usually those are associated with the Rhino render rather than the V-Ray render.
Oh, it has its own.
Yeah, it does. And yeah, I have the same issues too. You think you change one and it doesn't change, and then you get rid of all the materials and you purge them and you reapply. No, it's per rendering plugin.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, because I was like, it worked on one layer, it didn't work on the other, and I'm like, I think that's right. Okay. What that was for.
Yes.
Okay, that's really good.
Okay. All right, so yeah, that's not so bad. Let's, what I want to do here, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit so we can really see the difference between this step and what we're gonna do next. Let that go. So there's a couple of funky things going on in terms of the scale of the image versus the face of the geometry. Some of those things are easy to change, some of the things are harder to change, but I'll show you a really good starting point. And what I want you to do is pay attention to the back edge of this wall. Remember we had just that, we drew it in plan and then we extruded it up. That's just, you know, a box, a rectangle, you know, it's got length, width, and height. But the edge of that is expressed as just a straight extrusion. What if I told you we could alter that while we're rendering, right? Just based on another image. And there's, let's see, there's four major kinds of bitmaps that you will use that will give you kind of the most bang for your buck. The first one I've showed you, it's just a texture map that changes color and pattern of something in the scene. The second one is what's called a bump map, which based on basically the grayscale values of this image will add more pixels where it thinks it needs to be darker and lighter pixels where it thinks it needs to be lighter. So it's kind of a self-shading condition based on an image you give it. And that just affects the output, right? It doesn't change the geometry of anything. It just shades your render in different areas. The third kind you're going to use is called a displacement map, which takes the same kind of data, except it physically alters the render mesh. So if you have a grayscale image of this, where it is, where it's darker, it's going to pull that geometry out, and where it's lighter, it's going to push that geometry back, and you can invert that relationship. But basically what that's saying is if I had a black and white image of this, then when it gets applied to this regular rectangle, it's physically going to pull out the bricks and physically push back the mortar, which changes the edge expression and actually changes the shadow as well. If I put a really hard light on this, I'm going to have a square shadow. If I put a really hard light on something that has a displacement map on it, that shadow is going to reflect the way that it got altered.
Is the thickness still the same, like 8 inches, like
It
the
is.
furthest part of the stone? Okay.
After it gets changed like that?
Yeah, when
No.
you add the texture, it's thicker?
So in this case, no, but for that displacement map, yes. I'll do that next and I'll show you the differences. But then the fourth map that you can apply is what's called a transparency or opacity map. And it still takes the same black and white grayscale data, same image, except where it's black, it doesn't render anything, and where it's white, it gets rendered, and anything in between makes it sort of semi-transparent, okay? So what I'll do is I will use the exact same image. Usually you want to kind of alter it yourself in Photoshop. Let me take a sidebar and show you how to do that just really quick. Let's say, let me open Photoshop really quick. I'll just show you how to make it. I mean, you should know how to do this, right? Make an image black and white, kind of posterize it. I'm going to show you anyways. Drag and drop. Copy the layer so I don't edit the original. Control-Alt-Shift-B is the shortcut to make things black and white. And then let's say I don't know, alter the levels. So bring up the darks, bring up the whites, maybe a bit darker. Right, so now it's a bit more extreme between what's dark and what's light. If I wanted that inverse relationship, I would just add an invert layer to it, right? So usually you want to work with black and white images for bump maps, displacement maps, and opacity maps.
Wait,
But,
bump? What was the first one? Bump?
Bump,
Okay.
displacement, and transparency. You have more fine control, right? For example, oh hey, you know the darks are too dark or the lights are too light, right? You can edit the grayscale of the image and see the direct relationship to how that alters your render and your geometry. So you don't have to do you don't have to do all those edits in the rendering software. You can do it in Photoshop. Okay? But for what we're going to do, I'm just going to use the exact same image. So if I go here, let's go around maybe to this. I'll go back to the material editor, and on the wall material, what I want to do is scroll down until I get to where it says maps. And right here, I've got bump, I've got displacement, I've got transparency. I can do that here. But for this one, I'm going to enable the displacement map. So I'm going to check that, and then again, click the M, go back down to bitmap like I did before, and I'm going to select the exact same image. And what this number next to it means is how much that image is multiplied by, like how effective that displacement ends up being. I won't change it, and I'll show you what happens, and I'll show you the telltale signs of what and how to change those things. So, right now, it's going to take a bit longer because we're physically altering geometry now. But you'll see what that image does to this. Okay, so we can kind of see it coming through. What has happened is all of the grout has been extruded and all of the bricks have been pushed back. We don't want that. We want that to be the inverse. That's just a simple click we can do in V-Ray, but also, see what's going on here? We don't want that. That's too much. So that means we need to lower the multiplier. So there's two things we need to do to change what happened, right? See how it looks fuzzy, and if you can't see, you can get closer and come look. It's fine. But that's not the way that we want it to look. Interesting, but not what we're exploring right now. Okay. So to change that, I'll go back to the material editor, and if I click on the M again, this little check mark right here, if I click invert, that will change the relationship between what gets pulled out and what gets pushed back. So I knew I wanted to do that, but I also want to lower the multiplier, this number right here. 1 is way too high. Let's try 0.2. So if I render again, it still takes a while. So when you start doing the displacement maps, it takes longer to process because you're physically altering geometry.
Oh, the multiplier, how did you know to start with 1?
That was the default.
Is it, oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, that's looking much better. Still a little bit much. Let me pick a different angle and I'll show you really what happened there. Let's say, let's see over here. I'm going to render again really quick. And then we'll be able to see that the edge of that wall is no longer a straight line, but it moves back and forth based on what was pushed out and pulled back. And that's all just based on the image that you gave it. Right, see right here, this corner brick? If you can't see, come up here and look at it, but it's no longer a straight edge. There's a brick, and then the wall moves in to accommodate the space for the mortar. And then it comes back out again where the brick is, which is tectonically representative of the way we make walls, stone walls, brick walls, whatever. Even if they're, precast and you're just gluing them on a poured-in-place wall, it has that same relationship. All right? Everyone see that? Does that make sense? Yeah.
How'd you do the invert option? Make the option come up here?
Yeah. I went back to the material, and where I have my displacement map linked, I click on that M, and I check the invert button. Okay? So, you can sort of see it here, but if I physically change my viewport to the rendered view, which is kind of like a low poly version of what we're doing, I can zoom out and I can actually see my texture wrapped around my geometry here, right? This isn't a real-time render, I'm not rendering anything. This is just that render preview right here, that rendered view. Do not substitute this. You know, don't screenshot these things and give them to me and say, hey, look, I rendered. No, you didn't. You screenshot, and I'll fail you because that's gross. Okay. But one thing that you can see that's going on here is that this image, when it gets to the edge of the geometry, it wraps around and it continues, right? And in terms of a stone wall or a brick wall, incredibly important in doing that to convey that level of realism. For example, if the coursing stopped here and then a new pattern started here, that's unrealistic, it's unbelievable. And obviously it's a render, but if we can eliminate all those little things that make us think that maybe it's not a photograph, then we can't believe the imagery as being professional and serious, right? And so the way that we get that is by altering the way that the image is applied to the geometry. In Rhino, I think there's 6 different ways to do it. I'm going to show you 5 of them. And the way to check what mode it's in is I'm going to click on it, and if I go over to Properties, and I click this little foil ribbon right here, it says Texture Mapping, it brings up this window, right? It's set to box because that's what we did from the previous class. But I'll cycle through all of these to show you the difference between all of these different mapping modes, okay? Questions so far? Yeah.
What did you mean by too much with the 0.1 or with the 1.0 and then the 2.0?
It ended up so
Like there are too many bricks for the
well,
thickness?
no, not really. What it meant was when I applied that displacement map, how much it ends up moving it based on the black and white value,
Oh.
it moved it way too much. It ended up looking fuzzy, and it
Okay,
wasn't.
I see.
It wasn't
So
what I
you're
was
trying
looking
to
for.
make it like kind of the right scale?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of what you do in pretty much all rendering is saying, okay, here's the default values. I don't like it. Let me change it and re-render and see what changes.
Does it look clear?
Yeah, because let's say you're doing, I don't know, you and Bethany, like right next to each other, right, doing the same thing. Your numbers may be different from her numbers, even though you're doing the exact same thing, exact same scale, same program.
As long as it looks okay?
Well, yeah, as long as it looks okay, but the numbers associated to what you change and the change that it makes is kind of different from scene to scene, even if you're doing the exact same scene. So what I mean by that is it's a trial and error process. Let me change this number, see what it does. If it didn't do anything, change it back. If it didn't do it enough, change it more. To kind of go past that, if we go back to this material editor here, right? There's a lot of different things that I can change here, right? And to be honest with you, I've touched less than half of all of these controls in any given situation. They don't do a lot to increase the quality of your render, but it will increase the time it takes to render the image. So in terms of that trial and error process, if you change something and your render time suddenly quadruples, change it back, because it's not gonna help, right? Yeah, so you can play with them if you want, but in my experience, they don't change a lot. Okay, so let's go back to the mapping mode. So you have custom, surface, planar, box, spherical, and cylindrical. I'm going to show you these 5. And all this does is change what Rhino does to the image before it projects it onto the geometry, right? So in, for example, spherical mode, what it does is it,
Oh.
hello. what it does is it rips that image apart and then reprojects it as a sphere. So that's kind of what it does before it applies it. So the first one here, I'm going to apply surface mapping. And when I click that, watch how it changes. Right? It kind of changed direction. It changed scale. Scale is another thing that I'll show you how to change. But what that does is each surface that is associated with this geometry now has its own texture, so that, let me increase that scale just a little bit. So that, that sharp edge between patterns, obviously it's the wrong size, wrong way, but that corner where the one surface turns into another surface, it's mapped completely differently. It's based on that individual surface to where you can't get it to wrap. So in terms of this geometry, surface mode is not what we want. In other cases, surface mode is exactly what you want. It might be, for example, the water surface for the pool. You would want surface mapping because it is just a singular surface. If you have little bitty surfaces that represent the leaves of a tree, and then you apply the leaf image to those surfaces, you want to use surface mapping. Okay? So the next mode is planar mapping. And what happens is when I click this, Rhino asks me to define a plane. So let's say I just do the XY plane right here, right? And I'll show you that later. But what it does is it's mapped the image pretty correctly onto the top of the wall. But all of these faces here, they've just kind of been stretched and smeared and extruded down the face, because what Rhino did was, because we said planar mapping in the XY, it orients that image in the XY and then kind of just pushes it down the rest of the way. Does that make sense? If I rotate around, it's done that everywhere, right? It's kind of just streaked all the way down, which, again, very interesting, but not what we're looking for. Okay? The next mode is box mapping. That's the right one, so I'll go back to that one for this geometry. But if I go to spherical mapping, again, it asks me to define a sphere. Let's say I just do this right here. And now, what that did was it changed the image into a sphere and then projected it onto, this wall, this rectilinear wall. You would use, if you had a spherical object, you would absolutely use spherical mapping, like a basketball or something else that's spherical. So that's a mode that you would use to map that object, but not appropriate in this case. The next one would be cylindrical mapping, which, again, we define the cylinder. We'll say yes to the cap. But then what it does is change that image into a cylinder and then projects it straight down onto the object, which would be appropriate for cylindrical shaped objects like maybe trees, light poles, other cylindrical shaped things, but not in this case. So what we're going to end up using for this particular, well, I would say for all of the walls, we're going to use box mapping. So when I click that, it asks me to define a box, but the most effective way to define the box that you're trying to box map is by using the bounding box of the thing you're trying to map, right? Because it kind of fully encapsulates all of that geometry that you're working with. So I'll say bounding box. I'll leave it at the world coordinate system. It asks if it wants to be capped or not. I say yes. And then that appropriately maps that texture. The scale is a bit off, but at least in every corner, I can see that the texture wraps all of the coursing lines up. It's a little screwy on the top, but in terms of the renders we're gonna make, you know, they're eye level renders, so you never see the top of the wall, because it's the wall, all that kind of stuff. Right? So that mapping mode works for this object. And now I want to change the scale of the mapping so that in this case the bricks get smaller, but also they look kind of stretched out. You could find stones that big, but the other ones are a bit more square, and I think that might fit, maybe that'll fit the space better. I don't know. It's not the most interesting space. We're just trying to be consistent. So what I'll do is I'll select it, and the way that we would change the scale of this particular map would be under the UVW repeat. UVW is the exact same thing as XYZ, except it's related to each individual object. So XYZ are world coordinates, they're constant, they're consistent, we always know which direction and which way and how much and all that kind of stuff. That's a constant that doesn't change. UVW does the same thing, but if this wall were tilted, then that UVW would be, you know, tilted in the same way. To where that, so U is X, V is Y, and W is Z. If it's tilted this way, then I can say, oh, I want it to repeat in the W rather than the Z, and it's local rather than global. Does that make sense?
So it's like attached to the object.
Yes, it's attached to, and each object has its own UVW data, and you can access that, you can change it, you can alter it to your heart's desire. If I were to change, you know, the direction of this particular object's UVW, I could put it at an angle, change nothing about this, and the texture would be applied at an angle rather than straight up and down, or any other direction that I see fit to apply.
So if the texture is like a wrong orientation, like the floor was meant to be.
It's easier to rotate it here under UVW rotation. It's easier to do that than it is to reformat the UVW coordinates for each object. Okay. But since everything here is kind of flat planar and obeys gravity, we'll be fine. Okay. So what I want to do is then just change the ratio of U, V, and W to say that, oh, okay, if I have one image being projected here, you'd say the ratio of the image is 1 to 1, and the ratio of this wall is probably, I don't know, 2 to 3, maybe 1.5 to 3. Then that means that the ratios between the image and the geometry don't match. So I want to repeat the image so that the ratios match the geometry. Does that make sense? If I have more images going across the same space, then that means that each image takes up less space, therefore shrinking the image. Okay? So let's try 3. Oh, here we go. It's not bad. Let's change this to 2. Right? So what I did now was the way that this wall gets wrapped is for every U there's 3 repetitions, and for every V there's 2 repetitions. Okay? It's kind of just a ratio between image and geometry. It has nothing to do with the size of either of them. It's all about ratios. Okay? All right. And what's nice about that is, you know that we have that displacement map associated with this texture. That updates as well. So I don't have to go back and change, you know, the way that the displacement map gets tiled, and I don't have, you know, a mismatch between color and texture and shadow and all that kind of stuff. It updates all together. Okay? Questions? Are you sure? That's good. Yeah.
When I try to render it, it's really bright.
It's really bright? Okay, we'll get into that next. So, let me try to simulate your conditions, okay? we're going to take a short detour first. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sun to this scene, okay? And that's very simple to do and actually pretty cool. What I want to do is, if you hover over the sun, I can left click and say add sunlight system, and then this window pops up. I can either say that, okay, we're gonna have a, let's say a southern hemisphere sunrise, right? Or a northern hemisphere sunset, right? I can control the azimuth and the altitude, you know, based on, you know, if we're in the northern hemisphere, the sun only exists here. If we're in the northern, it only exists here. If we're in the southern, it only exists here. And then the sun only rises between 0 and 90. If it's here, there's no sun, right? It changes to nighttime. As a default, I like setting it at about 45, 45. That's kind of a nice default. You get kind of long, sharp shadows based on where the light source is coming from. Or if I wanted to simulate real-world lighting conditions, I can deselect manual control, and I can scroll down, and I can pick somewhere on Earth. Let's say, let's do Los Angeles. Where'd it go? Here. Oops. And then, so based on that location, I can pick a time of the year, right? Let's say, day, April 30th. What time is it? 5. If I say OK, it asks me where I want to put the sun. The default is 0, 0, 0. Does not matter. In terms of lighting conditions at the scale of a human, all light vectors are infinite and therefore a line rather than a spherical field, because the sun is so much bigger than we are. So when I say that, it'll go to 0, 0, 0, and a couple things will happen. One, this rendering is going to be way too bright because I've added a light source to something that was kind of balanced. And what that will also give me is much deeper shadows, because I put in basically a sunset time. So all of the cast shadows are going to be long and not quite exaggerated, but we have really long shadows because we have low light, right? Not quite so bright in this one, but let's say the image were really bright. I'm going to force it to be bright so you can see. Okay, so I altered some settings to make sure that the image is way too bright. When it finishes rendering, you'll see. Come on. All right, mostly done. But okay, so this image is way too bright, right? It could also be way too dark. It depends. Let's pretend you're in this space and you have a camera. You take that picture and you get this result. What are you going to change to make that image darker? No. Everyone needs to lose their obsession with ISO. It doesn't do anything for us.
How long it's open, it's exposure.
Yes. I knew what you were saying, but you weren't using the right words. Yes, shutter speed. So, do I need to make the shutter speed faster or slower? Faster. Right? So the way that we change that here, this is where 3.0 doesn't have these controls. All you can change is exposure. But
Does 4 do that?
is there a version 4?
I think so. I mean, I had, well,
No, that's
maybe
Maxwell.
I think Maxwell does have camera controls.
Okay.
The way that I get to that is if I click on options over here, I get all of these buttons, And if I expand camera, I can control everything that I can on a manual camera. Shutter speed, white balance, F number, ISO, lens shift, exposure. I can change all of those things that I could have changed on a manual camera, right? So in this case, my shutter speed is 5, which means 1/5, which is 1/5 of a second. That's kind of slow in terms of shutter speed. So what I need to do is increase this number to make it a smaller fraction of a second to where it's, you know, opening and closing much quicker. So let's say I change this to 100, right? So now that's 1/100th of a second rather than 1/5 of a second. Open for less time, less light hits the sensor, the image is darker, right? So I can re-render. And based on my lighting conditions, that's probably okay. We do have a really extreme sun angle, which I think I might change. But image isn't so bright anymore because I increased the shutter speed. Okay? I'm going to change the sun. If I wanted to change it rather than create a new one, if I select it, this is the arrow right here, that's my sun vector, my lighting vector. If I click on modify sun, I can do the same things that I had done before. You know, if I want to change location, time on Earth, or if I don't care about that and I just want to put in an angle. Say it's that. Okay. So now when I render, I should have probably more highlights, which we can change later. But the lighting might be more appropriate for the scene we're trying to create. So there's definitely too many hotspots. I think I need to what's going on there? Something funky is going on here. But I think the image needs to be darker anyways. So I will increase the shutter speed again. That seems a bit better. Okay. Any questions before I move on? All right. So I changed the color, right? I was able to create a texture that was just a solid color. I was able to create a texture that is based on an image. I was able to alter the shade and shadow of that image based on the same image by applying it in a different way. But now, I think another material we might need for this particular scene is something that is shiny, right? Let's say that all of the fences and gates are made of, I don't know, polished anodized steel. Maybe they're black, maybe they're white. I don't know. Color doesn't matter. I'm going to show you how to make something reflective and shiny. So, I'll do the same way that I do every other material. I will create a new one. Create new material. And in this case, I will do a V-Ray material. So the difference for what we're using is V-Ray material. If you're doing something simple, just like a flat color, reflection, refraction, or shiny, see-through, V-Ray material is much easier to edit. If you're applying bump maps, displacement maps, opacity maps, much easier to do in a standard material because there is a place to link those versus the V-Ray material does not have a place to link those. Okay? So I'm just gonna give it a color and make it shiny, so I'm just gonna use the V-Ray material. And then right here, I'll change the name, I'll call it steel. And under diffuse, so remember diffuse is color, So if I want it to be black, I'm not gonna pick solid black. No, there's nothing in our world that exists as solid black in terms of, you know, solid RGB black. So I'll make it just a bit of a lighter gray. But when it exists in the space, it'll look black. Say okay. And then to make it shiny, that's the next section under here, reflection. And next to reflect, there's another little swatch. And the way that V-Ray calculates shininess, see-throughness, opacity, anything that can be considered on a scale, does so on a scale of black to white. So in terms of reflection, black is completely matte, not reflective. White is a mirror finish. So to change that, I click on the swatch, and the lighter the color, the more reflective it gets. I could pick any color, but it's only going to care about the value, because it's on a scale of black to white. So let's say I make it really shiny, almost completely reflective. Now, when that material updates, I can see the reflection of this checkered background in the shiny black material, right? Which we know is not completely black, but because of the way that it's being rendered, we perceive as black. Because solid black is kind of an unnatural color, it doesn't really exist. So I'll do the same thing, steel, apply material to layer, and I'll apply that to my steel layer. Now, I'm going to make it a bit brighter because it didn't show up so well in the other class. Let's see. I'll zoom into something to where we can see its reflection. It might end up reflecting on itself. Click render. Shiny things take a little bit longer to render as well. See-through things take a bit longer to render. Because what it actually does, have any of you taken like a physics optics course anywhere? No? So what the rendering software does is called ray tracing. And it depending on the emittance values of the substance that the light passes through changes the angle of refraction and how powerful the light is and how many times it bounces through whatever it's bouncing through. That's exactly what this software is doing. It's making all of those calculations. So not the best angle here, but it is picking up reflections of the wall over here. It's picking up its own reflection of the crossbar above here. And it's also up here reflecting this part of the wall over here, right? That's not shadow, that's the reflection of the wall in front of it, right? But because it's black, you know, shiny black things don't reflect too much, but that's how you make things shiny, okay? The next material I want to make is something shiny and see-through. So let's do the water, the pool, and the fountain. So again, we'll do it the exact same way. Oops. I'll go to create new V-Ray material. I'll call it water. I'm not going to change the color because the color of the water depends on the color of the sky, right? I can make it reflective, right? We know how to do that. Water is pretty reflective. I'll make it maybe not as reflective. And then to make it see-through, the next section under here is called refraction. Refraction is another name for how many times light bounces through an object or how see-through an object is, right? So it does the same thing. I can select the swatch. Black is completely opaque and not see-through, and white is completely translucent as if it weren't there at all. Water is somewhere on the higher end of that. So let's do this. And then again, when this updates, not only do I have reflection of what's around, but I have since it's a spherical sort of lens, it's warping what I'm looking through, so I know that that means that it's see-through. I will apply this to the water layer. Now when I go to render this,
That looks like something from Minecraft.
so it's very, very subtle, and we're gonna end up changing this. But we do end up seeing the bottom of the pool because of the refraction. The depth of the things we see below the pool are altered because, you know, when you look at something underwater at an angle, it's incredibly foreshortened. And it's reflecting a bit of what's going on over here. We can probably punch that up. It's probably too opaque and not reflective enough. So we can alter that. Why don't we do that really quick? So I'll go back over here. I will make it more reflective and less refractive. Let's see what we get. All right, not bad, but it still kind of just looks like glass because it doesn't have a color to it, right? I could either give the rendering a sky, give it something to reflect, or just like I've done for every other material, is give it a texture map. So what I'll do is I'll go back to the material editor, and under diffuse, instead of changing the color, I will link a water texture. Now when I render it, it's a bit too blue. I could probably, the light's too strong too. I need to change that. But rather than it just being, you know, a clear sheet of glass, now it's got, you know, ripples and things on it that come from the texture itself, which isn't exactly accurate to what's going on, but it makes us believe that, oh shit, that's water, right? Not bad. What? There's, oh, you can actually look at this. You can see the reflection in the shiny black metal of all of this going on over here. Super subtle, but we can see how reflective that is, right? And also, since this is the same material here, now the reflectivity of this shiny black is reflecting the reflectivity of the pool, and there's, you know, this really, really weird kind of bouncing going between the two. We can also see how tiny, I modeled some steps in here, but we can see how tiny they look because of that steep angle of viewing. All right, not bad. Another thing that we could do, we're actually gonna have to create another texture to do this, but rather than having this be that flat surface that I modeled, what could I do to it to physically give it waves? How would I do that?
Same thing you did with the wall,
Same thing I did with wall. What did I do with the wall?
depress the ground, pull out the bridge.
Uh-huh. Do you remember what that's called? Does anyone remember what that's called? Displacement map. Displacement map. No. So, unfortunately, I do have to create another material because the one that I have created, there's no place for me to link a displacement map. Right? I can keep scrolling through. There's none of that under this particular type of material. But what if I just create a new one, and in this case I want to do a standard material because that's the one that lets me link a displacement map. I'll rename this to Water 2. Under color, again, I'll give it the same exact map, bitmap, water. The transparency here is linked to how transparent the map is rather than how transparent the geometry ends up being. So you could alter this and it still works on the same scale of black to white. I want to add a displacement map of the exact same image. But I'm going to lower the multiplier because 1 is way too much. Again, I'll try 0.2. And then for a standard material, instead of changing reflection and refraction in the same way, what I do is I right-click on the material, go to Create Layer, and I'll give it a reflection layer. And that shows up top.
Oh my. Oh, I didn't even see it.
And the default is white, so it makes it super reflective. Maybe I'll make it not so reflective. And then again, I can right-click, create layer, add a refraction layer, because that makes it more see-through. The default is white, but it's not as transparent. We need to increase that a bit so that it ends up being more see-through. Okay. And then I will apply this to the water layer, even though there's one already associated with it. When I reapply this other texture, it'll overwrite that. Now what I'll do is I'll zoom in a little bit over here so we can actually see the edge of the water and see if our displacement map did what we wanted it to do, which was alter the edge of that water to make it look like it's moving a little bit. Maybe there's wind, right? Because water doesn't always just sit still like that. Questions while we wait for this?
Can't you just do glossiness too, or would that do something different?
Glossiness is technically different from reflectivity. I think glossiness cannot be as reflective as reflectivity can be. I haven't messed with glossiness too much. So this will take a little bit longer because this material has a texture map, is reflective, is refractive, and has a displacement map. So there's a lot of things going on with that texture to that surface that it has to calculate and display. got into Chicago? Did you just get back from Chicago? You didn't go? Oh. You should have gone. Oh, you didn't? Oh. Yeah. Yeah? Can you rephrase that question?
You know how you edited the shutter speed?
Yes.
Is it like a little symbol or is it like?
No, it's under options, and there should be, are you using the same version here? Oh, then you don't have it.
Oh, okay.
Much longer, but that's okay. It might be super cool.
Can you save the rendering, or is it just like?
Yes. There we go.
So after a while, like doing all that, trying to see all the details and stuff, it does get tedious with time, right?
Absolutely. Which will be kind of the next thing I talk about. But I mean, look, it fucking looks like water. It's crazy. I just took a picture of water, and now it's great. Now maybe not so much in the light. Looks better in the shadow. Kind of gross over here. All right, cool. So yeah, we can make a rippled surface of water. We can do that. I think those are all of the types of materials that you'll have to make, at least for this scene. A flat color, something that has a color and pattern to it, altering the geometry to make that pattern more realistic, making something shiny, making something see-through, making water. We can do all of those things. So in terms of moving forward, obviously I'm not done, but in moving forward, you should at least be able to reference this to create any material, really. And the most important thing is the image that you source, right? If you find just some tiny little image on Google and try to texture map it in a giant rendering, it's not gonna work. It's gonna look terrible. You wanna look for high resolution textures. You wanna remember when we were multiplying the tiles of the bricks on the wall? Sometimes you can see that line between the first repetition and the next repetition. So if you look for seamless textures, what that means is the edges will continue no matter how many times you tile it, at no matter what scale. So at the bare minimum, high resolution textures. If you can find them, high resolution seamless textures. Okay? All right, let's not look at that. So let's say I'm gonna put the other material back on there just so the next render is quicker. Two layer, to the water layer. Okay. So let's say we have everything textured. Obviously we don't. But let's say we're okay with it. We're going to take a short side detour again, and we're going to talk about resolution. Okay? Does anybody know how we calculate resolution? Say it louder.
Pixels per inch.
Okay. So, how physically do we calculate that? Let's say if I gave you a number of pixels per inch, also dots per inch, DPI means the same thing. If I said that our DPI had to be 300, how would we figure out the size of our image?
Doesn't matter as long as
So it sort of matters. So let me show you this. If we go to options here, and if we go to output, these numbers that pop up, these numbers are in pixels. Okay? So that means it's 640 pixels wide by 480 pixels tall. Right? Is it 640 pixels by 480 pixels. Right? And we established that DPI or PPI, doesn't matter. If we said we wanted that to be 300, then what's the size of this image in inches? We have dots. We have how many dots per inch? We're looking for inch. Calculators, anyone?
2.13 inches.
2.13 inches?
Yeah. And it's 1.6 inches.
1.6 inches. Okay. There were a lot of blank faces on that. Does anybody not know how we got that number? We have DPI is dots per inch, right? If that equals 300, then the number of dots that we have is over X inches. We know how many dots we have. We have 640 of them. Divided by X, 300. So, 640 divided by 300, in this case, gives us 2.13 inches. Right? That is always true. This number might change, this number might change, this ratio never changes. Okay? So let's say I have this, right? And let's say I told you, okay, don't render, okay, I am going to tell you, never render anything less than 300 DPI. You may render more depending on something larger, but never render less than 300, except for when you're doing test renders. If I rendered this at 300 DPI, let's say I was doing like a 10 by 10 or a 12 by 12. I did one at home this weekend, left it overnight, still didn't finish. And I have a beast of a computer, so I can't expect you to do that. So in terms of test renders, you can do, lower numbers of pixels, which translates to smaller size, lower resolution. So you get them done quickly, right? You can go through a lot of them just a couple minutes at a time. But final renders, never less than 300 DPI. So if I tell you, you need to make a 12 by 12 render, what are the numbers we put in here? Say it louder.
3,600.
Yes. Which is 12 inches times 300 DPI. Gives us 3,600 pixels. In that case, if you knew that that was going to be your final size, then you could render your test renders, something that I usually do, at 10% the size. So if it's supposed to be 3,600, I'll render it at 360 by 360, so that at least when I press the render button, the aspect ratio of 1:1 in that square is maintained, right? If I had done, I don't know, 600 by 300, then it's a 2:1 aspect ratio rather than a 1:1. And all I have to do is increase this to 3600, and that will be a 12 by 12 at 300 DPI. Right now, at 300 DPI, this is 1.6 by 1.6, something like that. I'm not good at math. But it's a very small image, 1 inch by 1 inch.
And to change those settings is under VLS options. What's the command that you do to get there?
I clicked on options here, and it's under the output tab. For 3.0, where is it? You showed me. Where, sorry? Yeah, so where you change the output size in pixels? Somebody showed me. Options. Okay. So, if I render this out at 360 by 360, and I try to put it on a 12 by 12 sheet, and I try to make it fit, what's going to happen? Why is it going to be pixelated? What's another way of saying that? So, yes, but the technical way of saying that is I'm lowering the resolution, right? If this is only 360 pixels wide, at 300 DPI, it only should exist at an inch. If I make that exist at 12 inches, then I've lowered the resolution by 12 times because I have the same number of pixels occupying a larger space, so therefore there are less of them per inch. Right? So what's nice about rendering software is if you know exactly what your print size is supposed to be, and I tell you don't ever render anything less than 300, you know exactly what these need to be, so when you bring it in Photoshop, if you need to, you can make it smaller, but you never make it bigger, because you should never have to, because you can re-render it and technically make it bigger, right? You don't always have that freedom with a camera. With rendering, you do. You can make it as big as you want. I think I've made 8-foot renders. It takes a really long time, but you can do that. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to let this go at full size. It's going to take a minute, but the next thing we'll move into is how we bring it into Photoshop and how to composite and what to composite and all those kinds of things. It's going to take a minute. So in the meantime, questions? It's going to take a minute, so we have time. Yeah. Yeah.
So when I was trying to, you know how we apply the displacement map to add a texture?
Yes.
And how your route was like shooting out really far?
Yes.
I can't get anything to shoot out that far. Like even when I turned that slider up, nothing was really extreme in my texture.
Are you using this version?
I'm trying to, I'm replacing my displacement map with a black and white.
Try that.
Out of this.
Try that. I'm going to cheat and lower this. I don't feel like waiting for it.
Just like, what do you?
Well, that worked. It really worked.
It did work?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Looks like crap.
I've never had a situation where it was like, hey, here's the color image versus the black and white, and it had a huge difference. It's just if I wanted more control, I would use the black and white, but that's good to know. So I'm doing this at a third of the size. It's fine. I will stretch it and make it bigger. You will not. You'll just have to wait 2.5 hours to get your image. Which brings me to my next point. Renders take a long time to process, right? So, if hypothetically something like this is due next week, you don't start rendering the day before it's due, because it'll never be done, and you won't have enough time to print it, won't have enough time to Photoshop it, composite it, which also takes time. Yeah, so it's all time management. But I haven't decided when this is due. Sometime next week sounds right. It depends on how much time I want to give you for your final project. Exploding and drawing and modeling found mechanical objects. Like a stereo receiver or a tube TV or a drill or probably not something like an iPhone or an iPad, because unless you have a disposable one, because you are going to take it apart, photograph it, and draw it, and render it, and put it back together, and then re-explode it and redraw it. Thrift store, antique shop, Harbor Freight, they have really cheap tools.
So basically just like a box on that.
I mean, it's more basic, it's not as basic as that, but yeah. Something that you can find and take apart and don't mind taking apart. Typewriter, maybe an old computer. Yeah.
For this one,
Yeah.
you need a sky.
Yes.
Does it work the same way? It was like we're putting it on an object like bitmap, or is it just?
I'm going to show you a different way of doing it. But that is one way of doing it. It's a bit more of an advanced technique. Nothing else? No other questions yet? We still got time. It's still rendering. That's what I'm waiting for.
So I'm trying to apply a wood texture to my trellis
Yes.
beams, and I'm trying to rotate it the right way.
Rotate the texture.
Yeah.
So I would start by choosing the right mapping mode, which is under properties.
I did the box.
You did box, and it's not going the way you want it to go.
No. I just screwed my rotation.
Try cylindrical. Capped cylindrical.
Was I supposed to cap my box one?
Yes. So this is when it does finish. This is the render I'll use to show you how you can composite things. Obviously, you're going to have a concrete texture for all the pavers. You're going to have a ground texture for the planted areas. You're going to have a ground texture for the turf areas. The house is going to be painted, and it should have a texture, right? Because a painted house isn't flat. It's got some. You could use like I don't know, take a picture of the ceiling and use it as a bump map. A picture of sand would work too. You're going to have a wood texture for the trellis. You're going to have a see-through kind of glass texture for the windows. Maybe dark or shiny aluminum for the window mullions. Every single thing will be textured. Okay? That water looks okay from this angle. Not bad. So, what another thing that you can get out of this render, so let's say for example, this is the image we want, right? To save it, I'm just gonna click on the floppy disk. Does anyone know what a floppy disk is? Okay, good, good.
You're not that old, you're not that young, there we go.
So I'll click save, and you can save it in a variety of formats, JPEG, PNG, TIFF. I like TIFF. You usually get a higher compression ratio. You get, if you're going to add like tags and metadata to the image, TIFF supports that format. Otherwise, JPEG is fine. I don't recommend PNG because of what we are going to do to the image. So JPEG or TIFF. Call it render 1. So now, before I close this window, there's one other image I can get out of this that I'm going to use to help me composite in Photoshop. And it's what's called an alpha. And what an alpha is, I'll still save it as a TIFF or whatever the same format is. And well, if I just click it, I'll show you what it is. It's this, this white button right here that shows me the alpha channel. Everything that is white is considered geometry, and everything that is black is not considered geometry. And the process of rendering is changing all of those, you know, volumetric, vector, math-based surfaces into an image. And the alpha is kind of the link between the 3D modeling program and the 2D compositing software, right? Because as soon as we bring that image into Photoshop, Photoshop doesn't know what's geometry and what's not. It's just a bunch of pixels. That's all it cares about. But this alpha helps us differentiate between what is solid and what is void, basically, right? So I click on alpha, and I also save that. And I'll call it render 1-A for alpha. All right? And to get that, you just click on this white circle here. So I've got 2 of those images. Ooh, I forgot to do something. Texture mapping trees. I forgot to do that. Okay, we're gonna texture map trees before we Photoshop that render. Sorry. Was anyone able to find 3D trees or anything like that? Like I told you to do this weekend. Okay. Sorry? Okay, yeah, that works. Personally, I'm not a fan of 3D trees. They can help you. They can help you figure out, you know, space. You know, if you're going to composite it with a 2D image afterwards, at least you can have it as a placeholder. They drastically slow down your file and your computer and drastically increase your render time. But they could be nice. To each their own. I'll show you how to use them and then tell you that I don't like to use them. Okay?
So what do you use? Do you just not do that?
Well, that would be in the compositing process afterwards, using cutouts, which I also told you to find. There's some in the entourage that I passed around. Some of them aren't so great. You can probably find better ones. Okay, so let's put a 3D tree in here and texture map it and then render it. So I've got, say I put it over here. If I go to here, I'm going to pick the first one here. And what I have is OBJ of a tree that I'm going to use. Just drag it and drop it. Drag, drop. And then this window pops up, open, insert, import, attach. We want to insert. Okay? I'll say okay. We'll get a couple more windows that pop up. You can just say okay to each of them. Say okay. Say okay. wait. It takes a minute. It's a big mesh, so not like a mess, but a mesh, like a different kind of geometry. It's meshy. That was the joke.
That's too funny.
So we'll wait, and we'll click where we want it to go. And so usually when you download an OBJ, sometimes the texture will be linked in the actual data of the file to where you don't have to texture map it. This one is not texture mapped, but it came with the images that you should use to texture map it. So if you find one like, oh shit, it's not texture mapped, at least I can show you how to do it. I need a new laptop. That's what I need.
No.
Okay, there it is. So I click, and then it just goes there. Once it catches up. All right. So for this particular one, the way that the way that the leaves are modeled. Right. So each individual leaf is kind of just its own surface, right? It looks a bit different, but it's just a surface, right? It's got a little bit of a bend to it. If I rendered it, it would just be the shape of the trunk and the branches and twigs, with the leaves just being represented as those flat little, look like tickets, right? And because it's not texture mapped, it's just going to be that white clay model. Maybe I can do it really quick without taking too much time. Okay, it's sort of. But with the OBJ that I downloaded, I got a texture for the bark, I got a texture for the leaf, and then I ended up making, you should know how to do this, I showed the other class but realized that you know how to do it anyways, making the image of the leaf just black and white so I can treat it as opacity, right? That's kind of the fourth map that I talked about that I didn't explicitly show how to use, but works the exact same way as a bump map, displacement map. It's just a black and white image. Maybe there's some grayscale, but everything that's black does not get rendered. Everything that's white does get rendered. Anything that's gray in between has some sort of transparency to it. So in terms of wanting to represent the leaf, right? So if I apply the image of that leaf to all of those surfaces, what I have is the image of a leaf, and everything that is not leaf is rendered in black. But this is a PNG, and it's technically see-through, so I need to make that everywhere that I don't want to be rendered black, and everything else white. And then when I link both of those images, I'll show you the result, but it's this leaf applied to each and every single little bent ticketed surface. It is a surface, receives light, shadow, casts shade and shadow onto each and every single little leaf that's on that tree. Kind of cool. But if I go back to here, that's taking too long. You get the idea that that's just, the gray model, right? I'll spend more time rendering the tree so we can see what happens. So let me stop that really quick. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create two layers, one for the material for the bark and one for the material for the leaves. Bark, leaves, color. Bark on the bark layer. With the leaves on the leaf go back into the material editor, create a new material. I'll just do V-Ray material. I will call this Spark, and I will link the image of the bark to that. Here's the bark. And then when I say OK, we can see that image wraps around the sphere, right? And now I can apply this to the bark layer. Apply material to layer, bark. I will create, I'll create a new layer, or sorry, a new material, and I'll also do another V-Ray material. Call this one leaves. The diffuse, the color, bitmap, and then link the original, just the color image of the leaf. And then what we can see is the image of that leaf kind of gets bent and wrapped around that sphere, but everything that is not leaf is rendered in black. That's why I need to link that opacity map so that it's not rendered in black, but not rendered at all. Completely translucent. So I link that here on the very bottom. So the maps for a V-Ray material, we can only link opacity, versus the maps for a standard material, we can do bump, displacement, reflection, refraction, all those kinds of things. So I'll do the same exact thing under maps. Click M to reference an image. We select the bitmap. And now I'm selecting the black and white version of that image that I had. I didn't get it. I had to make it. Sometimes you'll get it. Sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll get something that looks like a height field image. It's like green and purple, and it's got a weird blue background. That's the same kind of image, just linked in different places. But when I say OK, and this texture updates, that black now goes away because it's rendered as completely translucent, right? So if I apply this to the leaves layer, maybe make the render a bit smaller so it doesn't take so much time. Just a little bit. Now when I click render, it's still going to take a minute. But all of those individual little surfaces are now going to be leaves that take sun, shade, and shadow and cast shade and shadow onto each other and also onto the bark of the tree. I mean, we can already see that there's a difference. The last time I rendered it, it was just that gray color. Now there's some green in it because the leaf is green. So we know something is working. But this is just a small portion of a tree, and it's taking a long time to render. If I were to have that in the background of one of my scenes, rather than just placing in, a cutout image of a tree, this takes much longer. But it's completely viable. Maybe you have a beast of a computer too, and you can do it. Maybe you have a nice desktop at home. I don't know. You don't have to, but if you do, there's no way of me to know that. You do.
Huh?
You do. Not anymore?
You mean my computer?
Yeah.
I'm switching to my business software.
Oh, okay.
It's
That's fair. That's fair.
Kevin, does it make any difference to choose CPU or GPU rendering?
Yes. But as far as I know, GPU rendering software is prohibitively expensive.
There's a switch.
Really?
In the new one.
And I found the camera.
And a what?
And I found the camera.
Right, I don't
Oh,
have-
okay,
I
cool.
don't have it right here. I'm rendering.
Oh.
I'm stuck.
I have this camera.
He can show you. Yeah, I was curious, like.
I have this.
Um, might not see much of a difference. It may go a bit, maybe a little bit faster, but the quality is going to be the same. And the difference is when you're rendering with your CPU, it only ever uses one core because it's a non-hyperthreaded process, versus the GPU can render with multiple GPU cores at a time.
So I'll play around and see. The tree comes out so good. It's amazing.
Are you using the same tree?
Yeah.
Yeah,
crazy.
it's literally the first one I found. It was like 3D tree, download. And then the next one I found was terrible. It's garbage.
It seems like it's amazing. It's free.
Yeah, yeah, it was free. So as soon as this is done rendering, we'll move into the Photoshop portion. Questions? I asked the first class, but what is your experience with Photoshop? Just being forced to do it because you had to do something for studio?
Yes.
And you get to help everyone. You get to help everyone. Then.
She's
Um,
Photoshop what?
So the things I'm going to show you in Photoshop are kind of advanced techniques, but I'll try to approach it from a beginner's perspective. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I need to get everything dumbed down.
So this is your mouse.
Yeah.
See how there's a couple buttons?
Move it to
Do that one.
Yeah.
This one, not this one.
Yeah, that level.
Photoshop question.
Yes.
When I'm in
Move what?
brush mode,
Okay.
is there a way to like hold a button down and scroll my wheel to increase my brush size, or do I have to hit the little button?
If you're not using a graphics tablet, yeah, it's just the brackets. If you're using a graphics tablet, it's just a scroll wheel. You don't. That's not to say I think you should get one just because of that, but that would be the difference.
I had a cheap one from Monoprice, not a Wacom.
Cool.
I've never gotten the drivers to work properly with Photoshop. Pressure sensitivity is whack.
I've never used any other brand, so I can only speak to Wacom's effectiveness. But I'm sure there are other brands out there that work just fine.
I think I just have to figure out the driver issue.
Mm-hmm.
I've read reviews, and the reviews say it's a good tablet.
Still waiting.
Oh.
Yeah.
So I did the texture on my trellis. I figured out it was the texture I was using.
Okay.
It looked, anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, it looked too stretched out on its own, so I thought every time, wherever it was applied, it was stretched out.
I understand.
It was a shitty texture. On my trellis, each vertical, or the horizontal, the repeating bit,
Yeah.
the texture there is obviously, you can see it repeating.
Yes.
How do I?
You could change the UVW angle slightly.
And it'll,
You could change the mapping mode.
oh, okay.
You could maybe have 2 or 3 different textures and kind of apply them in a random sequence across the top so that they're not all exactly the same. That those subtle variations from piece to piece across that texture is going to increase the realism. If you're doing, let's say if you're doing like cylindrical mapping for all of them, the cylinder that you define could be slightly skewed at an angle from piece to piece so that they don't look, digitally identical.
So if I'm applying a cylindrical mapping to all of those horizontal,
You're gonna do it one at a time. Yeah. Oh, look, we're getting leaves. Look. Look at that. Wow. I'm not making fun of you.
Yeah, at the same time, God.
And it's a little blown out, but where the edge of the leaves meets, you know, a different colored background, it's no longer that square surface, it's just the shape of the leaf, because we use that opacity map.
So as I'm individually cylindrical mapping each one, I can go and change the rotation to each one different to make them look better.
Yes. When I was doing it, I just because I did it just to see. I altered between box mapping and cylinder mapping and surface mapping from piece to piece, and just varied randomly which ones I did what to. Getting some branches in here too. Those look mapped accurately. Pretty cool, huh? Someone else modeled it. We took the pictures. Sorry? Not really. So in terms of the other method, which I prefer, is not necessarily better or worse. It is, it also may not be faster. However, if you source the correct images from, you know, Google, 3D Warehouse, wherever you're getting images from, then the Photoshop method is definitely faster if you find a proper image. So I'm just gonna stop this. Oh, look at the little dappled light. That's nice. Look at that. All right. That's enough of that. All right. So now, right. So we'll go back to the renders that I had. Right. It was the RGB color rendering and the alpha rendering of the same image. Right. So what I want to do is, rather than dragging and dropping directly into Photoshop, I want to create a new file. That is Control N, or File New. And what I want to make sure of is that all of these numbers match up exactly to what I output for my render. For example, I happen to set it at 1200 just to make it go faster. But let's say you had to do 3600, right? That is either 12 by 12 at 300, or if I change inches pixels, then I type in 3600. But you also have to have the resolution attached to it. If any of those numbers are off and does not equal that same calculation for your output render, you're losing resolution somewhere. Or maybe gaining resolution, I doubt it, but most likely losing resolution. So you just want to make sure that those two are the same, the file you create and the image you import. So I'll do, mine happened to be, I'll do this and I'll just end up making it bigger. Don't copy what I'm about to do because it's bad practice, but I'm going to do it for time's sake. I'll drag and drop. You're still going to do that. And then it'll show up. You press enter. It'll show up. You press enter. Right. A little bit off. But now what I have is the color render and the black and white alpha image, right? Everything that you drag and drop and place in it should exist as its own layer. Usually each item is its own layer. Layers work the same in every kind of layered program, except for the fact that an Illustrator also does this. Any layer that is physically above something below it will mask it. So if I turn this top layer on, I do not see the bottom layer because it's physically on top of it and it's covering it up. I can't see it. So what I want to do is use this black and white image. I'm going to try to go as slow as I can because this is actually kind of complex. I'm going to use this black and white image to select all of the geometry that's in here. The quick way of doing it is, using some selection tool like a lasso or a magic wand, and maybe carefully, trying to draw around this, and maybe you get it, maybe you don't, and it's a little wonky, and it doesn't end up working, right? And doing it this method is you can tell that it's done that way because it's not done cleanly. And if you find cutouts that are cut out using this method, it's not clean. Don't recommend it. Don't use those cutouts. There's a better way of doing this. Not saying that this tool isn't useful. I don't think that's the right tool for specifically what we're going to use, what we're going to do right here. Okay. So there's a couple of things that I need to do before I can get this image to read as an image. This little icon right here, that tells me that it's a smart object, which basically means that it's uneditable. And to edit it, I need to rasterize it. So instead of it saving certain editing data from whatever program it came from, because there's a lot of different ways to get images into Photoshop. What I'm doing now is converting that level of data into just a bunch of pixels. And that's all I want is, in terms of this, just black and white pixels, and in terms of the other one, black, white, and brown, and green, and blue pixels, whatever it's made of. I just want it to be the little dots. And the quickest, easiest, and fastest way to rasterize an object or a layer is to try to erase it. And the reason I say try is because since it's uneditable, it won't let you erase, but it will ask you if you want to rasterize it anyways. That's the quickest way. And honestly, I forget where the rasterize button is.
Click on the layer. And up there.
Oh, you know what? That's probably a tiny bit faster. This is a tiny, tiny, tiny bit faster. Okay, so I'll show you the way that I do it, and then we'll use Olivia's method because that's a little bit faster. But so if I try to erase it, E is the shortcut for eraser. I click. It asks me, I can't erase it because it's a smart object. Do I want to rasterize it so I can erase it? I'll say OK. All right. And then the other method, to right-click on the layer, rasterize layer. Same thing. I've always used the eraser. Maybe I never learned where rasterize was. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But thank you. Okay, so now that they're rasterized, I can create what's called an alpha channel. This is an alpha image. And in terms of channels, we access those. It's right next to the Layers tab. And what a channel is basically another way of organizing data based on color rather than object. And it's also another way of kind of breaking down. For example, we're in RGB mode. If I isolate the blue, if I isolate the blue, I get the red and green. If I isolate the red, I get the green and blue. It's the layers of color. Has anyone ever done screen printing or silk screening before? No. That's the idea that you can only do one pass, one color at a time. So you do the cyan, you do the magenta, you do the yellow, you do the black. You're only using 4 colors, but by the time you're done, you get a full color image because of the way in which the color is applied and in what density, what areas. Look it up, it's fascinating. It's really great. But same idea applies here. Since we're in RGB mode, we only have access to red, green, and blue. If we were in CMYK mode, we would have access to cyan, magenta, yellow, black. So in terms of being able to create selections based on pixel data rather than object data, I'm going to add a channel that allows me to customize my selection, but it's based on geometry rather than pixels. And that's the link between that 3D program, whatever you're using, and the image, right? Otherwise, Photoshop has no idea what to make of what. It's just a bunch of pixels as far as it's concerned. So the way to add that channel is to go back to layers, and I want to make sure that not only the layer is on and visible, but that I have the layer selected. The layer is selected if it's highlighted in blue, and I want to make sure that I'm only selecting, in this case, this particular layer, okay? So to select it, I'm just gonna press Control-A to select all. See those little, they call them marching ants, that's your selection window. If you accidentally select something and want to deselect it, it's Control-D. So Control-A to select all. I'm going to Control-C, copy, or whatever it is on Mac, I don't know. I'm going to go to Channels, and I'm going to click the Create New Channel button. When I click that, it already calls it Alpha 1. It doesn't matter what it calls it, but that's usually the next channel you end up creating in a composition like this. And then I'm going to Control-V to paste that image as data into my alpha channel. And I'm going to deselect, Control-D. Okay? So I haven't really done anything except, yes?
Wait, so you said create new channel and
Yes.
it made that alpha 1? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Whatever it names it, it doesn't really matter. It's not like the name would change the function of it. But it should call it that, so you know that that's what it's used for. So all I've done is add that geometry data into a customizable selection menu. And now what I'm going to do is this little dashed circle down here. What that does is, if you hover over it, it says load channel as selection. You can do that for any channel, but when we're doing it for alpha, I click that, and now I get the dancing marching ants over all of the white areas, which means everything that is geometry at an image level. Okay? So to correlate, so the last thing, to correlate this selection to the image is to go back to layers and click on, the color RGB render itself. I can turn this layer off because I'm not using it anymore. But now the area of selection only selects solid geometry, right? Everywhere in between here is not selected because there's space in between the bars. And all of this there, in terms of my Rhino model, there's nothing there. It doesn't get rendered, it doesn't get selected. If there were some random, sphere or cube up there that I forgot to get rid of, it would add that to the selection too, based on that alpha channel. Okay? And the reason I do this, which there is probably a quicker way of doing it, but in terms of more complex geometry, the reason I do this is so that I can invert this selection, Control-Shift-I, and now instead of all of the geometry being selected, everything that is not geometry is being selected, and I can delete it. And now I can put things in the background. I can add a horizon line and a sky and everything that I didn't end up modeling because it would take too long to model, don't care to model it. now I just have an image that's cut out. And let's say, for example, I put, let's go to, I'll go back to this really quick. Palm tree.
Do you make those the same way, like if you were to make, like, those things you're inserting?
So you could, but there's not a really, in my experience, there's not a reliable way to turn a photographic image into an alpha. Because I mean, as soon as you take that picture, you know, it's pixels, right? And I can't distinguish between all those kinds of things on a camera, at least. There are, you know, graphic artists and graphic designers who get paid a hell of a lot more than all of us to do that kind of stuff. So we might as well use their resources rather than try to do it ourselves. But yeah, they have their own methods of photography and cutout and all that kind of stuff. But so because I was able to delete that sky, this tree can now sort of exist behind and give us that illusion of depth and space and all that kind of stuff, right? Which also allows me to add a sky into this. The sky texture I have is really cheesy, but just bear with me.
It's on fire.
Super cheesy, but you get the idea. Right? So it's up to you to find better textures, to render everything into the image that needs to be rendered, to find the best cutouts that you can find, to add context-sensitive people, right? We don't need a BMXer trying to jump into the pool, but maybe somebody dipping their feet in is more appropriate. However, in terms of composition and atmosphere and mood, you could add, I don't know, if it were appropriate, a Brachiosaurus eating part of the tree there. Again, context sensitive. Let's say, for example, let's say I added a person. So these are all super old, and I hate them, and I'm sick of using them. Is the bench visible? All right, let's put this guy sitting on the bench. So it's super easy. However you get the cutouts, get the cutouts. I don't recommend doing it yourself. But I can just drag this. Maybe I'll cut that a little bit. Drag it and drop it. Right there. Make them a little bit bigger. Let's put them on this one.
Why is he holding his leg so high?
I mean, she looks like she's giant, right? However, at this point, she does look a little bit big. So
I think he's just lifting his legs really high.
let's just get rid of her. So now we could probably make it just maybe a bit smaller. So there's a person in here. However, the level of light between this photograph and the rest of the render doesn't match. Not only is he sitting in shade, but even if he was sitting in sun, still I think it's a bit too bright. So what we want to do is add what we would call an adjustment layer. And the reason that we add an adjustment layer rather than just going to image, adjustment, and then doing whatever the hell you're gonna do to it. Doing it this way, you can't go back, it's not isolatable, it's not redoable, it's not like, you can't continue to tweak it. Versus, if you have your adjustment tab here, if you don't have it, go to Window, Adjustments. All of those same things that you could have done under that other menu are selectable here, but let's say I wanted to decrease the brightness, right? Make him look like he's in shadow. What that does is that gives me a layer that I can keep going back to this window to adjust the brightness and contrast. And I can make sure that this layer only affects the layer below it. For example, let's say I start changing the brightness. That's affecting the whole image, right? I don't want it to do that. So if I hold down the Alt key, and see that little square that pops up? That means that any adjustment I do to this adjustment layer only affects the layer below it. You want to make sure that you do that. So now when I change this, it's only changing the brightness of the little guy. Right? So if I do something like that, that seems to be more appropriate, right? Now it seems, it's still not perfect, but he fits the image better than he did before because I lowered the brightness of that particular cutout. And you want to do that for everything that you add in. I may also want to, I don't know, paint in a little shadow, right? Because my shadows were rendered based on that bench being there. But he doesn't have a shadow because he's just an image. He's not geometry that could have cast a shadow. So I could, if anything that I wanted to paint, shadows, plants, I'll show you. It's good to add a new layer and then to paint just on that layer. For example, if I were to, not pay attention to that, and then if I use the brush tool, which is B, and I just start, start painting, right? Whatever I'm doing, that ends up being on this layer here, right? So if I wanted to change anything about that, like the color or the shape or whatever, you can edit all of that. I can't because it's now more pixels on top of pixels that exist, versus if it were on its own layer, I was just, doing my own thing, right? Now at least that's a layer I can turn on and off, okay? But in terms of giving this guy a shadow, if I hold Alt, instead of it being the color that's selected, I can sample maybe this color, and then make my brush a bit smaller. I'm pressing the bracket keys to make it smaller, or I can change the size here with this drop down, change the size. What I probably want to do, and I don't know if I can do this with a mouse, but I'm going to try. Shadow, probably in here somewhere. Maybe it's a bit darker. Something really small, probably too big. So maybe I just altered the shadow underneath him. Probably too much. Hard to do with a mouse. I like graphics tablets. You don't have to get one. You can get really good at using a mouse, and you should. So this space should also, in terms of the imagery you create, that's why I also included the planting plan on Blackboard, so that everywhere there is a plant on that planting plan will show up here, right? If there's a tree, you put a tree. If there's a shrub, put a shrub. If there's ground cover, put ground cover. And you can, I would reference the most lush places you can think of, because in 3 plants are not enough, but 50 is probably too much. So somewhere in between 3 and 50.
Oh, yeah.
But, so for example, say you found, I don't know, 15 cutouts. Oh, not quite enough. I don't like the way that this one hits here, that one's size, or this color, or whatever. You can paint those as well with the brush. So I'm still on my painted layer here. And if I press B, that's the brush shortcut. I can change. You know, I have a lot of brushes. There actually should be a lot in the entourage I provided. Should be a lot of brushes you can use. But some of them are, you know, shaped like plants, so that instead of them acting like a brush, they act more like a stamp, and you can layer color that way, right? So, no, never mind. You know, put down, you know, the darkest layer. Make some of them maybe a little bit bigger, a bit smaller. Right? And then you can add in maybe some highlights. Maybe we had even deeper shadows. And then maybe if I'm done with that stamp, I could just switch back to a regular brush. And paint in some of these darker areas. And then I can paint in more highlights. Right. So it's something subtle and in the background, but sort of believable as something that might be there. Again, this is super quick. I promise I can do much better than this. But the last thing you might do is, depending on how you stamped or painted those things in, is trim it based on the geometry of the wall. So we believe that it's coming out from behind that retaining wall, right? Because that's where the plants are being planted. By having that hard edge, it helps move that thing back in space. Yeah? I don't remember what I told the other class to do by Wednesday. Yes, I do. You're going to texture map your entire Rhino model. Everything will be texture mapped. You can have a lot of different options if you want. Oh, I don't know if I want this to be stone or brick or concrete or tile or travertine or onyx or gold. I don't know. I don't care. Figure it out. Texture map everything. And what we will do Wednesday is may or may not go over the requirements for this project, but I will make time for desk crits so we can see what each individual texture is looking like. Let me do some troubleshooting on it. Yes?
Could you put like a screenshot or something that we can't trace, but just to get the general picture of what just the Rhino model is supposed to look like? Now, since it was already supposed to be new, yeah, like that.
There you go.
Because
There you
could
go.
you scroll behind the wall to the smaller patio?
Over here?
Okay, the grass goes, okay, all right. can't make the grass slope, but okay.
Yes, you can.
I got enough. Tried it so many times.
We
I'll do it.
did it last week.
Okay.
Someone help her. We did it last week. All right. Sorry? What angle do you want to see? Did you find this image? Do you have access to it? No? Okay, it's something we did last quarter. I'll email it to you right now. Okay, I think I put it on the lecture portion of Blackboard rather than, okay, sorry. So you have it now? Oh, then I don't need to send it to you.
I have a question.
Yes?
So like, as far as like the wall, the base of the wall and like where you snap your like sloping needing to go, like,
Yes.
do you draw the wall? So you know how the steps are 4-inch papers
Yes.
and they're like down?
Yes.
The wall is like at the top of those and you extrude up from that?
Yes.
And then to snap the turf, you go at that midpoint?
So I do it at that same sort of base ground zero level that the whole drawing exists at.
Okay.
But because I'm moving that 2 inches down, for that offset between the paver and the turf, what I end up doing is extruding the walls a little bit further down.
So you just move them a little bit?
Right. So what I did, so if this, so if this one is that 4 inches thick here, and then this surface, which should exist at this level here, ends up moving down, then that means that I end up seeing a gap between what is supposed to be planted and the bottom of that wall. So I just extruded the bottom of the wall a little bit more. Just a bit more. Okay. Yeah, okay, so get this texture mapped by Wednesday. Right? Today's Monday, right? Sorry?
For the fountains, do we have to add a fountain?
No.
Okay.
I have another question about that.
Yes.
So if you want to extrude, like further extrude something that you've already extruded, so it's not like a curve or some more like a object, what command do you use? Is it,
You can still use extrude surface because three-dimensional things are made of surfaces, right? So in the case of the walls, I'm assuming,
yeah,
you can select that surface and extrude it down.
okay.
Or you could scale 1D from where it is down to somewhere else you want it to be.
Okay, that was the command. Okay.
All right, if you have no questions, you may go. If you do have questions, I'll stay for a little more.
I have a question for my life.
For what?